I am Walter Veit, and I'm a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Reading. My guest today is Daniel C. Dennett, emeritus professor at Tufts University and one of the most influential philosophers and cognitive scientists of his generation. He has written several highly influential and acclaimed monographs, such as Consciousness Explained, Freedom Evolves, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, and Breaking the Spell. He has also won notoriety for being one of the 4 Horsemen of New Atheism, along with Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Sam Harris. Today I will talk to Dennett about his recent memoir, I've Been Thinking. His views on consciousness, free will, religion, the importance of evolution, as well as philosophy itself. I hope you will enjoy this conversation as much as I have. All right, welcome Dan. It's a pleasure to have you as the first guest on my podcast.
Good to be here.
And let's dive right in. You wrote a terrific book titled I've Been Thinking, a memoir recounting much of your life, your intellectual journey, views on consciousness, free will, evolution, God, and philosophy. You also provide people with advice for how they can become better thinkers. So let's start with an easy question right here. When and why did you decide to write your memoir?
Well, I guess I've been telling stories all my life, and seemingly often to good effect. It's often been observed that you ask me a question, I may respond with a story. And I thought, well, yeah, I've got quite a lot of good stories. And also, I think I wanted to show young would-be philosophers some of the pitfalls and some of the opportunities that philosophy offers if you do it my way, which I recommend, and if you don't do it some of the old-fashioned ways. I can't remember exactly when I got it in my head to do it. I guess after From Bacteria to Bach came out, I thought, well, maybe it's time to make a list of what I'd put in such a book. And I got some encouragement from some friends and family members and other philosophers, so I went ahead.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, one paragraph I liked in your book a lot is where you talked about how hard it was actually for you to get published initially in philosophy journals, which might be surprising to some, right? So here in 1965, you received your DPhil from Oxford, but you said many of your peers thought that your writing didn't even qualify as philosophy, right? And now you're one of the most influential philosophers of your generation. So it would be interesting to hear from you what you think philosophy is, as well as perhaps what you think its goal should be.
I think whenever you don't know whether you're asking the right questions, you're doing philosophy. And that's in any field. That is, if you've got a perfectly good question you know how to answer and you're doing physics or chemistry or biology or history, that's not philosophy. But if you suddenly wonder, am I wasting my time on this? Are there better questions to be asking? Then you're doing philosophy. And the thing about philosophy is there's no rules. There are no rules. Lots of philosophers want to introduce rules, and some of them are pretty good and pretty obvious, like don't contradict yourself and make sure that you represent the alternative views fairly and accurately. Don't waste your time shooting at the trivial mistakes around the borders. Go for the jugular. Go for the big idea. So I think philosophy it's not an exact science. It's not mathematics. It's not science. It's what two people, Itai and I've forgotten his name now, Lurcher, called night science. It's what you do in the bar after the lab is closed down, what you talk about, and the hypotheses and conjectures and hunches that you explore when the tape recorder's turned off. When I was spending a lot of time at the AI lab at MIT on the top floor of Tech Square in Cambridge, Mass, the top floor, there was a room called the Playroom. And it had bag chairs and some games to play. But that's where the serious thinking got done, was in the Playroom. And I thought, yeah, right. There should be a playroom in every field. And that's where the philosophy happens. It's and it should be a little bit too, like Las Vegas. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. People should be allowed to make outrageous mistakes without worrying about being teased and hounded and blamed and scolded and branded. Check it out. It works. That's what philosophy is.
I think that's very nice. In the beginning of your book, you also introduce a game to make this point more clearly. Now, I myself have played chess in my youth. I went to tournaments, played in local leagues and so forth. And there you introduce what you call chess as a variation of chess where the king can move 2 squares into any direction rather than just one. Why did you invent this game?
Well, I wanted an example of something that was difficult, intellectually challenging, and trivial. And a sort of an intellectual jungle gym on which you could exercise, but that wouldn't be of any great importance. So think of all the people you as a serious chess player know that many people, many brilliant people have devoted their lives to proving things about chess, exploring all the possibilities and proving things and then disproving other things. So those are the truths of chess. Well, I invented a game which I've never played, never want to play. I don't know if anybody's ever played it. I don't care. It's simply a variant on chess that, as far as I know, is not worth thinking about. But there are infinitely many truths of chess. And it would be hard work to prove them. And people might even make names for themselves by proving truths of chess. So what? What's it good for? For nothing. It was my way of illustrating one of my favorite obiter dicta of Donald Hebb, the great Canadian psychologist. If it isn't worth doing, it isn't worth doing well.
I think that's a very nice way.
And I think that's a motto that should be treated with care, because we sometimes don't know whether something's worth doing until we try it and get very good at it. Then we may discover it wasn't worth doing. Okay, well, we've learned something important. It's not worth doing. So I'm not calling on a relevance or importance czar or committee to rule which activities aren't worth doing. Take your chances, blurt it out, get out there. But just remember that a lot of things aren't worth doing well. And philosophy is a field in which, because of the insecurity of philosophers, if a professor or an esteemed colleague expresses admiration or respect or even interest in something you do, this can have a disproportionate effect on you, and you're pretty soon you're sucked into doing that because you've been praised and patted on the head and listened to for doing it. But you got to worry about that, because maybe you and your little coterie of nitpickers are wasting your time on an artifactual puzzle. That's just one of my warnings to young philosophers, is try not to get sucked into make work. There's a lot of make work in philosophy.
Yeah, when I was perhaps 12 and playing chess, I remember how we often would change the rules of the game. It was quite interesting, at least. We would explore those games, change the rules again. But I think ultimately we decided that none of those alternatives were really that interesting, perhaps, compared to the main game.
Did you ever play Ultima?
I don't think so, no.
That I can't remember all the rules, but I remember they changed the powers of the pieces. Like there was the dread immobilizer. The dread immobilizer, if it got next to an opponent's piece, it immobilized it. It couldn't move. And there was the withdrawer that captured by moving next to a piece and on the very next move moving away, and that captured the piece. They had a number of different rules like that. It was mildly fun. Very hard to cleanse your mind of the traditional roles, of course. So it was a sort of bizarre exercise of imagination. Well, it was semi-fun for a few days.
Yeah. No, I guess some variations of chess are played more or less competitively. It's like tandem chess, where you have a team partner, and whatever piece your team partner takes from the opponent, you can place it onto your board as to your own piece. I like that a lot. Bobby Fischer's variants of chess, of course, might be seen as a good variant, perhaps, of chess, where the initial positions of all the figures behind the pawns are more or less randomized, because
I thought that was a very interesting idea.
Yeah,
because it sort of turned the game into much less a game of learning lots of road openings, and you have to rely more on general chess principles than on book learning. Yeah,
that's right. Bobby Fischer hated it when he had opponents that would just study the moves until perhaps 30 turns later, whereas he was more of an instinctual player, perhaps. Yeah. Well, but perhaps it's interesting then to ask, given how philosophy has changed. I mean, in your book, you describe how in Oxford at this time, ordinary language philosophy was really the non plus ultra. But now a kind of scientific style of doing philosophy in the way you are doing it has become much more popular. Then again, for many young philosophers that try to engage in this work, they might also struggle getting their work published, right? The work that really tries to integrate insights from different disciplines and then getting that into the mainstream journals. So it would be interesting to hear your views on that.
Well, we've made a lot of progress. I think one of the things that I'm actually proudest of is that today there are literally dozens of very good young philosophers, younger than I am, I'm sure, who know much more neuroscience, much more cognitive science, much more computer science, much more evolutionary biology than I do. And they've been in the labs, they've performed experiments, and that's the next generation that's carrying on some of the trends that I helped start. And I'm very, very happy to see that. And they are getting published, but it's still an uphill battle. And of course, there are many people in philosophy, traditional analytic philosophy or continental philosophy or any other kind of philosophy you want to call it. There are still people that look down on that or intimidated by it. I think one of the more sobering moments in my career was when I gave a talk at a graduate philosophy conference organized by graduate students in philosophy. This was at Brown University some years ago. Actually, that's where I invented Schmess in response to that. But over drinks, they were getting nice and relaxed. I was their guest keynote speaker. And several of them said, oh, they went into philosophy because you didn't have to know anything. And that appalled me. But I remember it from Oxford, too, when I was a graduate student. And there were lots of very clever chaps. They were almost all chaps. They were clever as the devil, very fast, very good with counterexamples. And they didn't know a darn thing. And they didn't think they had to. They could just live by their wits and know their Wittgenstein and their Austin and their Ryle and their Russell, and that was about it. And I thought, those are, well, they're wasted lives. They're wasted lives. People getting very good at something that doesn't really need doing.
Yeah, you have a really nice quote. I think this will be the only one I read out here, where you describe your own way of doing philosophy. I'm a pack rat, a magpie, to slices of what strike me as the most exciting or thought-provoking tidbits and leaving the rest of the interpretation to the scholars. I think I've learned a lot from Husserl, but some distinguished Husserl scholars might think my reading is irreparably ill-informed. I don't care. I turned to the Husserl to figure out how the mind works and got some valuable help from that reading. If Husserl himself would be aghast at my construal, too bad for Husserl. I am happy to give credit to him, but if Husserlians want to reject my gift, they are welcome to do so.
Yeah, that does express my attitude towards my approach to the history of philosophy. I have respect for those philosophers who do, for good reason, decide to become experts on Kant or Husserl or Frege or Plato or Aristotle, and that's valuable work. And one of the things that helps to undo is one of the paradoxes of teaching philosophy. And that is, you got to start somewhere. So you start with the greats. But when you start with the greats, your young students don't know enough to appreciate how great the greats are. And they get watered down, oversimplified, caricatured versions of Plato and Aristotle and Hume and Kant and everybody else. And then they think they know it, and then they never go back. And so time and again in my later years, I've gone back to a classic text and discovered, to my embarrassment, how little I appreciated of the real depths of that philosopher. So it's the historians, it's the scholars who do devote themselves to particular figures who keep us honest, and that's very important. It's perhaps not as glamorous or exciting a philosophical role, but it's very important. In the same way that in the sciences, most of the experimental science that is done is not, Nobel-winning innovative stuff. It's keeping the field honest, filling in the blanks, correcting errors, checking, replicating experiments. And this work is all good, honest work. It needs to be done. And the strength of intellectual endeavor depends on those good citizens who do that work and do it well and do it with integrity. And my hat is off to them. And I sometimes blush when I think that I've been sort of parasitical on their efforts, because I go in with my smorgasbord approach and take a little of this and a little of that and a little of that and come up with something that strikes me as a new wrinkle, that's what I do best. But I'm fully appreciative of the efforts of the scholars who really dig down into the time and the era and the context and the minutiae in the works of others.
Yeah, I guess one thinker that might have influenced you, at least outside of philosophy, more than anyone else has been Darwin, right?
Yes.
So I'm wondering, when did you first read The Origin of Species, and did it already dawn on you back then that this would change all your thinking about philosophy?
I didn't read Origin of Species until, let's see, I don't think I had actually read The Origin of Species when I read Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. I think it was after that I went back and did a proper read of
Interesting.
Darwin.
Yeah.
And there are still, some of Darwin's great books that I've only skimmed. But I realized years before that evolution was the key. That was one of the main themes in my dissertation in Oxford. But how little I knew of evolutionary biology is embarrassing. But I got the main idea. Which is all learning is redesign based on the design you have already. It's a ratchet, and it's all a matter of trial and error. It's all a matter of generate and test. And generate and test has been the algorithm of innovation for billions of years. And all we've done over the millennia, but not millions of years, of science and human inquiry is build better, faster ways of doing generate and test using our thinking tools. The thinking tools that we invented using generate and test, well, often without realizing we were doing it. So the blind, purposeless generate and test of natural selection gradually turns into the deliberate, reflective, intentional generate and test of most of the methods in the sciences. And now we're even learning how to reharness natural selection itself, blind natural selection, to do further design enhancement and improvement in things like LLMs and artificial life and genetic algorithms. So we're coming back full circle, and we're letting evolution do a lot of the heavy lifting for us in science these days.
Yeah, one question I wrote down was related to, obviously you've been one of the pioneers in philosophy and trying to understand AI and accompany its development. But then we had philosophers like Hubert Dreyfus, who argued, we could never have an AI that even beats competent chess players, right? And I think that was actually a commonly held view, not only among him, but many other philosophers.
Bert Dreyfus was a very good philosopher. And Bert and I got along very well. we had some, over the years, we had disagreements, including on, national news television. But I always appreciated that, although I thought he was wrong, I thought he was making a sort of classic philosophical mistake. He was inflating his claims. If he'd just been a little bit more modest, if he had said that AI is much harder than you think, he'd have been right. And he'd been right for the reasons he gave. But he said it's just flat impossible, and that's wrong.
Mm.
And philosophers have a fatal attraction for absolutes. Something is flat impossible, inconceivable, just not possible. And very often that's mistaking a failure of imagination for an insight into necessity. And that's one of the chief foibles of philosophy, I think. And so we should always sort of take a deep breath and say, well, instead of trying to prove it's flat impossible, let's just make sure we understand how complicated and difficult it is.
Yeah, perhaps here it's worth talking about your theory of consciousness, where many philosophers, think of Thomas Nagel perhaps, really insist that if we introspect into our own minds, we're presented with certainties. This is how the mind works. And perhaps this could be described as your life's work to argue against this kind of assumption.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and Tom has been a wonderful, loyal opposition all these years. I mean, I've known Tom since he was a graduate student at Harvard, and I was an undergrad. And I gave the response to his back paper at the Chapel Hill Colloquium before it was published. So Tom Nagel and I have been sparring on these issues for decades, for 50 years, for more than 50 years. I think he's a wonderful philosopher, wonderfully usefully wrong, but thank goodness for his persistence, his inventiveness, his clarity. I love talking with Tom about what I think he's wrong about. And we've done that both in public and private. I was very upset with his being taken in by a creationist book a number of years ago. And privately, I scolded him. I said, Tom, this is a big mistake. You should not. You've had the wool pulled over your eyes.
Right. He did become somewhat of a hero of the creationist crowd at this time.
Yeah, and that was a lapse that all too understandable, given his general mindset. But he really blundered on that one, I think.
Yeah, you do praise him though also when he wrote his paper on the absurd. Perhaps you could go into this. There's a nice anecdote in your book on that.
One year at the APA meeting, the Eastern Division meeting, Tom gave a talk. You can read it. It's published. It's on the absurd. And he had asked his advisor at Harvard to be the respondent. That was a legendary philosopher who published almost nothing, named Rogers Albritton. And I was there. The room was packed. I remember the session. Everybody showed up, and Tom gave his talk, which is a downer. It's a rather bleak paper. And then Rogers, who was also my advisor. So Rogers Albritton had been my undergraduate advisor and had been Tom's graduate advisor. And Rogers gave a talk which was as wise and humane and understanding as I think any talk I've ever heard. And we all sat there, I think, just rapt, listening to it. And it starts with Roger said, he has a little example. He says, you're sitting at home, you're reading a book, listening to a record, and a phone rings, and it's an acquaintance, a sort of friend who has a problem, and is, thinking of suicide. And you stop what you're doing, and you deal with them. You try, and then you ask yourself, well, why do I do that? Why do I bother? Why is this important? And that was the springboard on which he launched his paper. And a few years later, I had a very, very smart, wonderful undergraduate student who came to me and said, in a challenging way, Professor Dennett, I'm thinking of killing myself, and I want you to tell me why I shouldn't. And since she was so smart, I took this very seriously. And I had an idea. I said, well, you got to make me one promise, and then we'll talk as much as you want. You have to read Tom Nagel's piece, The Absurd, and then you have to read Roger's Albritton's response to that, which he'd read, the way we read our papers in those days. And she promised. So Rogers had moved from Harvard to UCLA, and I called him up out of the blue and said, Rogers, this is Dan Dennett, and I've got this student who thinks she should kill herself, and I want you to send me right away a copy of your response to Nagel. And he said, oh my God, Dan, on my drive west, my car was stolen, and I got my car back, but the one copy of that paper was in the papers, and that's gone. It's lost. I don't have any copy. We didn't have computers back then. We had carbon copies. And I said, oh man, you're supposed to be the antidote to Nagel, as you were on that wonderful night. And he was about to hang up. He said, wait, Dan. Let's see if we can reconstruct it. And we spent, 45 minutes, maybe an hour on the phone. And that was back in the days when long distance calls cost significant money.
Right.
But we did a pretty good job of reconstructing the paper, though I have to say I've lost my notes from that now. But in any case, I met with her, my student, and we talked it through. And as far as I know, she's alive to this day. I sure hope so. And then I ran into Rogers at a cocktail party at the Eastern Division of the APA meeting. And I said, I just came up to him. I said, I really want to thank you for spending all that time and my student. I think it really did help. You rose to the occasion. And his face fell, and he said, oh my God, it was you. You were the one that was thinking of suicide. That never even occurred to me. And it should have. I said, no, you were right, Rogers. I really did have a student. It wasn't me. But thank you. It wasn't my life you saved, but I think yours. So that was a unusual adventure. Rogers was a lovely man, and probably one of the last examples of a tenured and much respected philosopher who published almost nothing.
Yeah, I guess that wouldn't happen nowadays anymore.
I don't think so.
Oh. Yeah, Albert Camus, of course, said something like, the only really serious problem of philosophy is the problem of suicide, right?
Yeah.
Perhaps we don't really see that in the animal kingdom with some exceptions. But when you became one of the famous Horsemen of Atheism. Perhaps this was also one of the questions you've wrestled with, that it wasn't so much about convincing people that the arguments for the existence of God didn't work, but rather providing them with meaning, an alternative source.
I think what has become more and more persuasive to me, to say obvious is too strong, I'll just say persuasive, is some people seem to be captivated by what you might call the trickle-down theory of importance. If God doesn't exist to give us importance, then nothing's important. God doesn't exist, then life is meaningless. Whereas Darwin shows that, no, there's also a bubble-up theory of importance. Nothing was important until we bubbled up to make things important. Important to whom? To us. Who else? And why shouldn't that matter? Why should it matter whether it's important to this imaginary God that is the creation of everything? The universe that we are discovering, thanks to science and all the related inquiries, is unbelievably wonderful, full of ravishing delights and beauties and ingenuities, whether you're talking about the ribosome, this amazing little machine that evolved over millions or billions of years and that makes life possible, or whether you're talking about redwood trees or the tides or the planet, or art or music or philosophy or mathematics, all this wonderful, wonderful stuff. And we have so many things to inspire us, to comfort us, to love. Why do we need a higher power to endorse that? We endorse it, and that should be enough.
Yeah, one thing I was wondering, so in your memoir, you almost seem to lament a bit the fact that it took you so long to write Breaking the Spell, and then it took you out of your core research on consciousness. Would you say that you regret it all, having gone into this literature?
No, I don't regret it, but it was not a labor of love. It was a labor of obligation. I got worried about growing little themes and threads of theocracy, and it seemed to me it was getting out of hand in the United States and elsewhere. I was worried about the rise of religious extremism, and thought that we, who I think know better, we're being too diplomatic and keeping our lips buttoned and just holding on. And I thought it was important to articulate the vision that I had and to show people that this was wonderful. And I didn't want to write a book disproving God's existence. That's been done 100 different ways. Ways. But I did want to write a book showing why religion exists. Why does it exist? That's a very good question. And especially if you don't assume, well, it exists because God made us believe in it. No, set that answer aside. We want to see if there's a neutral answer to why religions exist. And after all, everybody's, I think, an atheist about Zeus and Poseidon and Mars and Ares and Thor. We're all atheists about those gods, Zoroaster. Don't exempt any of the imaginary playmates of religion. But now we want to know, why does it have such a hold on us? This is not just an interesting question. It's complicated and it's important. If we screw up, if we don't understand why religion has the tremendous emotional hold on many people that it does, we'll make big mistakes, making them right now. This is a very perilous period in world history, I think. So I wanted to show what a naturalistic theory of the evolution of religion would look like. And it also was useful in providing wonderful examples of cultural evolution, mimetic evolution, which I think is finally people are beginning to realize, yeah, mimetic evolution is a real thing. And it really does play a very important role. And a lot of genetic evolution is actually dependent on and the response to mimetic evolution. We have famous cases like lactose intolerance in human beings, which owes its existence to dairy farming, which is not a genetic feature. It's a cultural feature that evolved. It's a cultural practice on which natural selection has been operating genetically for millennia, but not more than millennia. So, but in order to do the job right, I had to pour all my resources for a few years into just reading what other people had done on it, educating myself. I hadn't paid any attention to this literature. And quite frankly, it was only occasionally rewarding scholarly effort. I think an awful lot of bad second-rate thinking has been perpetrated on this topic, and sorting the good from the bad is a Herculean labor, and which was in itself depressing. But I did it. I'm glad I did it. I think it made a difference. I'm proud of the role I've played as one of the 4 horsemen of the New Atheism. But it was not the way, like the rest of my career, it wasn't a joy. It was a duty.
Yeah, are you optimistic at all about the future? After all, at the moment, we have a lot of, say, religious conflicts, abortion being prohibited in many parts of the US.
Well, what I wrote in Breaking the Spell towards the end was, I think, as it were, we're winning. I think the number of people who have escaped the opium of religion is growing. The percentage of people who have no religion at all is growing. But we have to recognize that means there are a lot of people that are going to be really hurt really hard, really bad. And I'm not just paying lip service to their anguish. In fact, in Breaking the Spell, I described, I tried to get people to see what it would be like. And I said, imagine that space aliens came to us in the United States. And they didn't come to conquer us. They came to educate us, to learn about us, to live in our world. But they had all sorts of things that they liked to do. And our young people just flocked to them. And our young people stopped playing music and stopped playing football and baseball and basketball and abandoned art. They abandoned poetry. They abandoned most of human culture because they found this alien culture more attractive to them. Think of what a calamity we would see that. We see that it would break our hearts to see this. We wouldn't want to see those traditions, those hallowed traditions. There's no religion there, just hallowed traditions. We wouldn't want to see all of those pastimes and rituals and thrills and joys and the art museums and the concerts. We wouldn't want to see all that just evaporate. Well, that's how people feel, for instance, in the Islamic world when they see lots of their traditions just evaporating in front of their eyes. They see their children. And I have to say, they're just going to have to live through that pain because we're not going to countenance that they treat their young women, their girls, as second-class citizens, even though that's their tradition. We are going to do what we can gently to encourage the wilder strains of religious belief and practice to reform themselves. It's a hard job. We should do it with all the honesty and diplomacy that we can muster. We shouldn't lie to them, but there's a sort of false tolerance that I think is deeply dangerous. We don't honor all religious traditions. There's some things, human sacrifice. No. They may have thought it was noble and wonderful back in the days of the Incas. No. Thank goodness it's gone. Slavery's gone. We're almost gone. Other practices are waning. Homophobia is waning. We can appreciate the confusion and pain of those for whom these are holy traditions. And remember that it would be like asking us to give up football and baseball and music, and rock and roll. An example I use in the book, I say, I don't want to live in a world without music. If scientists prove tomorrow that music is bad for the brain, we could imagine some, whatever you do, don't play music when your children are growing up. I so wouldn't want that to be true. And I would feel the strong temptation to just say, no, damn it, I'm not going to live in a world without music, and I don't want anybody to live in a world without music.
In your memoir, you also talk about music quite a bit.
Yeah. But we have to recognize that some of the traditions that we think ought to go extinct, like human sacrifice and slavery, are as identified by people as the very point of their existence. And we should try to sympathize, but not excuse.
I think that's a very nice way of putting it. Suppose the new atheist movement has a bit crumbled, at least a bit, one could say, in the last decade, slowly at least. Why do you think that happened?
I don't think it's crumbled. I think it's done its job. It's awakened the world to atheism. The percentage of people who are not going to church is rising. It's the fastest growing segment of the population worldwide now. And I said, be patient. We don't have to beat the drum for this. It's happening. I think all the pieces are in place. We now just calmly sit back, give the cake time to cook, give the cheese time to ripen. Be patient, be gentle. It's happening. We don't. And be ready to help put out the fires of anguish. A couple of days ago, the Pope fired a bishop in America. Good. That's a good sign. Congratulate him, thank him, and let's hope many other things like that happen. There's a lot of fires that we have to put out. There's a lot of people who need consoling. There's a lot of people who should be allowed to be comforted by their delusions until they die, basically harmlessly. So I'm all for keeping a very gentle pressure on, not overdoing it, because it'll backfire.
And I guess that can happen often, even in the history of philosophy, where in opposition to one view, the completely radical opposition is defended. It seems like we're often then not getting closer to the truth, right?
Right. Yeah. I think we philosophers are constantly in danger of being seduced by refutation by caricature. And after all, reductio ad absurdum is one of our chief tools. And that means that there's a motive for being less than completely sympathetic in formulating the views of those we think are wrong. And we have to take steps, very deliberate, positive steps, not to caricature the opposition.
Yeah, perhaps one example we could discuss is your defense of a compatibilist view of free will, right?
Yeah.
For many members of the public, it would seem, well, if determinism is true, free will couldn't possibly exist, right? And you've been very vehement in your criticism, say, of Libet's experiments that were meant to prove that free will doesn't exist. Yeah. Well, perhaps you could go into more detail here.
Yeah. I'm happy to say that one of the scientists who's been involved in that research, Patrick Haggard, is now writing a sort of history of the Libet experiment and their effects and why they are so controversial. So I've just recently sort of reviewed my own participation in that. I'm afraid I had something to do with the sort of bringing to the attention a lot of people Libet's work. I encountered it first in the lamentable book by Karl Popper and Sir John Eccles, The Self and Its Brain. I think perhaps the single worst book on consciousness and free will that's ever been written by two very distinguished people. But that's, golly, that's a wretched book. And I, having just said I don't want to caricature the opposition, that book is it's just inexcusably bad. But that's where Eccles trots out Libet as the proof of dualism. Instead of talking about Libet, let me talk about a more recent scientist who's come out on free will, and that's Robert Sapolsky in his book Determined. And he's a hard determinist. I'm going to be debating him on a Zoom call in a few weeks. And I'm really looking forward to it because I think he's a very smart guy and he has very good ideas, but he also makes a few clear mistakes. And the one that I'm most eager to demonstrate to him is that he's made the mistake of believing the philosophers who have inflated free will by thinking that it's important that our wills be not just practically unpredictable, but in principle unpredictable, which only indeterminism could provide. But there's no good argument for in principle unpredictability. Practical unpredictability, yes, we want to preserve our options. Game theory tells us we don't want our beliefs and choices and desires and decisions to be an open book to the other agents out there, because they can turn us into puppets if we don't keep our own agendas secret. And that's a very important point. But we don't have to have absolute secrecy. There's a retired physicist who calls himself the free will philosopher, Robert Doyle. And he's written a lot about this. And he lives in the Boston area. He sat in on a number of my seminars on free will. And he tried over and over and over again to convince me that determinism, that there was a good reason for wanting indeterminism to be true, for wanting quantum physics to come to the rescue and make human choice utterly unpredictable. So unpredictable, as Jerry Fodor once said, that even God couldn't tell whether Eve was going to bite the apple. And no, we don't need that kind of unpredictable. And he kept pressing me. And finally, I conceded that he was right. I could imagine a circumstance where I would want indeterminism, quantum indeterminism, to be true. And that was if I was playing rock, paper, and scissors with God for high stakes. Then I would want indeterminism to be true so that God couldn't read my mind and win in rock, paper, scissors. But of course, that's not a predicament I expect anybody ever to be in. So, and that's the only reason I could ever come up with for why we might want perfect unpredictability. So I think Sapolsky's just been taken in by the idea that if determinism is true, then we don't have the right kind of freedom. Well, we have a kind of freedom. We have the kind of freedom that comes with autonomy, with being controllers of ourselves. We're not responsible for the good fortune of having evolved to be self-controllers, but we have. And now that we are self-controllers, we're responsible for keeping it that way. In some regards, you're just lucky that you're a self-controller. But once you're a self-controller, you have a moral responsibility to protect your self-control from all the would-be puppeteers. That's the heart of free will. That's what, and if we look at the law, that's what we find.
Yeah, I think before.
And the notary public says, you sign this of your own free will. That's what the notary public is asking. Are you somebody's puppet, or are you acting with autonomy? And you can answer, yes, I'm acting with autonomy.
Yeah, before I read your work on free will, I would have considered myself an incompatibilist. But reading your work, it sort of seems like, why should we take the philosopher's notion of free will that is absolute, can't come in gradations, as whatever we should be interested in, right? If that's the case, how can we even distinguish gradations between someone who's drunk, someone who is in a clear state of mind, a child, an animal? It seems like we need an account of free will that can have these gradations, and whatever that account is, that would be something that's very much in line with evolutionary reasoning.
You know, if you look at the skeptics about free will, Sam Harris is a good example. They're always talking about people with brain damage, or people who've had terrible upbringing, people who are not fully in control. Right. They are not responsible. They don't have free will. But that doesn't mean that other people don't have free will, because Tom Wolfe once said, the word coming out from neuroscience is, don't blame me, I'm wired wrong. Well, what would it be to be wired right? And most of us are wired right enough.
Yeah.
Right enough, not perfect, but right enough to hold ourselves responsible.
I guess one move
Be
one
held
could
responsible
make.
by others.
I guess one move one could make is say, all right, let's leave this term free will to those who are interested in it, but we can talk about control. Some people are more in control than others. But of course, that raises the question why we should give up that term to the absolutists, say.
Well, yeah, in fact, I've toyed with that. I mean, I've run into the claim that probably most eloquently articulated by Sam Harris, that I'm just changing the subject, but I don't think I am. I think it's philosophers who change the subject. I think it's the philosophers who inflated free will, who said it's got to be absolute or it's nothing at all. Well, where else do we allow this? David Sanford had this lovely argument why there aren't any mammals. Every mammal has a mammal for a mother, right? Well, that means there's an infinity of mammals, or there's none. Must be that there aren't any, because there aren't any infinity.
Yes.
So obviously, mammalhood is something with fuzzy edges, something that grows gradually. And there's no principled way of drawing a hard-edged, bright line between the mammals and the non-mammals. We don't need to go looking for the prime mammal, the first mammal that didn't have a mammal for a mother. Forget it. That's schmess. But then, if that's true, then don't look for a prime mammal in the area of free will too. The original choice from which all your later choices devolve. Now, the philosophers have looked at that carefully. from Sartre to Kane to others. And they all end up positing sort of a prime mammal. You don't need a prime mammal. We need to recognize that freedom evolves, as I have said.
Yeah, in a way, it's very nice that you almost get the same sort of underlying structures in the debate of consciousness, where maybe you could see the debate about consciousness as really the debate with the most opposition that this concept could come in degrees, where the philosophers can't even conceive of the possibility, right? And
Absolutely.
then my dissertation, I really tried to develop this idea further. If we want to understand animal consciousness, we have to think about what you've called hemi, demi, semi minds, right? Only then can we really understand this gradual evolution of some creatures being more mind-like.
Yeah, I think, excuse me, I'm going to close the door because somebody's using the vacuum cleaner. And yes, I think, in fact, I think the view that consciousness comes in degrees, which is an idea that many people just find intolerable, unimaginable. It's become suddenly it's become much more important because we have the question of whether large language models, whether Chat GPT and the like could be conscious or a little bit conscious or something. And you have people like David Chalmers arguing, well, maybe a little bit conscious, or in the future they might be. And I think that's politically and socially dangerous distraction. Who cares where the line is drawn? The thing is that these LLMs are dangerous and they're competent. And the level of understanding they have is growing. And if you think, well, yeah, but thank goodness they're not conscious yet. Oh, that's just failing to appreciate that, right? And reptiles aren't mammals yet. Don't think that there's this magic cutoff point where boom, you got consciousness coming in. Now it's very easy to think of consciousness as something which divides the universe in half. There's the things that are conscious and the things that aren't. That's been a theme of Tom Nagel's, for instance, for more than 50 years. But we can think of consciousness as coming in degrees. In the important concepts of consciousness, the things that make consciousness so, it is important, but it comes in degrees, even in human beings. When Joshua Rothman wrote a profile of me in the New Yorker, he ended his profile by saying he was very, very reluctant to, very dubious of my view of consciousness until, and he wrote very movingly about his mother, who was dying and was getting dementia. And he watched her consciousness. It wasn't that she was comatose, but that her mind wasn't capable of reflecting, she wasn't able to appreciate or notice or think about or track or follow or imagine things that consciousness can do. and he began to realize that the question of whether there was nevertheless some special, wonderful property that was still there or wasn't, by watching it disappear gradually, he finally saw the point of my theory.
Yeah, perhaps there it's also worth pointing out that consciousness doesn't just to have to vary along a single dimension, right? You could have many more.
Yeah.
So for me, for instance, at some point I learned that I am on a Fantasia scale fairly far to sort of the right. So if I close my eyes and try to imagine an apple, I don't have one sort of appearing in front of me like Photoshop from somewhere where a picture was taken, but more like an abstract idea. And then there's others who have much more rich visual sensual experiences. Take the autistic animal welfare scientist. You've talked about her in your book. Remember the name?
Excuse me?
The animal welfare scientist. I think her name is Temple Grandin.
Oh yeah, Temple Grandin.
Yes. So when she talks about her experiences, she doesn't really think in sentences and abstract ideas. She thinks much more in terms of images. And to me, it seemed almost the opposite experience that I have when I think about my past. It almost seems like more a list of facts. But animals very likely have more the kind of experiences she talks about, where they perhaps have a very strong sensory images associated with particular events, right?
Yeah, I think that's one way of putting it. Aphantasia is a nice example of what can be studied. I'm very good actually at visual imagery, or I think I haven't been officially tested, but and I've tested others, a few philosophers with some examples of my own that I've dreamt up some questions that they've had a hard time answering. So I know there's questions that I can easily answer. They have a really hard time answering. Like, go to your boyhood bedroom. Cut a hole in the floor. Look through the hole in the floor. What's underneath your boyhood bedroom? What do you see? The hole. Can you answer that one?
No.
Yeah, there.
At least not in terms of an image.
Yeah, it's for me. That's easy.
Yeah, one philosopher, you might have encountered him, Colin Allen. He told me he has the complete absence of any mental imagery. So it's even more radical than in my case.
Yeah,
it's that people have such radical different experiences in their life really goes against this idea that consciousness is this all or nothing property people have or not, right?
Yes, and I think there's color blindness and blind sight, and
that's right.
Hemi-neglect, all these interesting pathologies of consciousness. And the idea that consciousness is this one super duper thing is as bad as the idea that free will is this one super duper thing. Not magic, it's complicated.
Yeah. Because in my book, for instance, on animal consciousness, I talk about reptiles and fishes as having these extremely complex brain halves that aren't very much integrated compared to, say, humans or birds, where we sometimes have talked about as potential candidates for two streams of experience. But it's very much possible that they could have, right? Two selves in a way, almost.
Oh, yeah. One of my favorite examples actually is sperm whales. They have eyes on the sides of their head, and there's the left-eyed whale and the right-eyed whale. And Melville in Moby Dick has a passage where he says sometimes he's seen, pods of sperm whales when they get agitated, they seem to be fighting themselves. They seem to go into a and I said, like two oxen in a yoke, there's Dexter and Sinister Whale there, and they're fighting for control. And it's possible. Rabbits show something similar. If you put an eye patch over one eye of a rabbit, there's no binocular overlap there, of course, and train that rabbit something, put the patch on the other eye, and you have basically a naive rabbit. So
that's something that bugged me with theories like the integrated information theory of consciousness. Why should we care about unity as this fundamental feature of consciousness, right? Why does consciousness have to be organized that way?
Well, I think unity, I think that's the one thing I like about IIT, about Tononi's work, is that not that he can answer the question, but at least he's got a way of asking the question, is a single sperm whale like two oxen in a yoke? Or is it like one ox?
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting scientific question to which we know the answer. And he's at least suggested a path that could lead to an answer. But that's just the beginning. That's not yet a theory.
Well, one could see why it has become such a popular theory among physicists, computer engineers, AI researchers, because at least in principle we could apply it to non-biological systems.
Yeah, in principle.
Yeah. Yeah, so do you think, you mentioned that AI poses something of a threat to us? It would be interesting to go more into that. Where do you see that threat exactly? Is it that AI will kill all humans, or is it something more subtle than that?
I think it's more subtle than that. I think AI might destroy human trust. And it might Eric Horowitz, the chief scientist at Microsoft, had a talk where he used the phrase "a post-epistemic world," and that chilled me to the bone.
Yes.
When we don't know what's true and what's false, when we are trapped in a sort of paranoid skepticism about everything, that would be terrible. That would be terrible.
Do you have any advice for young philosophers, how they should approach the field now? Should they focus on AI research?
Well, everybody should focus on it to some degree. I think it's a very important issue because it's immediate. We're not talking who cares about the singularity in 100 years or 20 years or 500 years. Right now, the dangers are there. And we've created these new artificial meme systems, which can evolve. And that could set off an epidemic, a pandemic, which we want to avoid, I think, at all costs.
Yeah.
So that's it. But there are many other topics. I think my advice here is the same as it is to my students at Tufts very often. If you think you have a really good idea, blurt it out, then you have something to fix. It may be wrong, but at least you've got something to study, to fix, to criticize, to get help with, and always get help from others.
Yeah, I guess this moves us to our last question. You mentioned in your book often that you really enjoyed teaching. Perhaps more so than other philosophers, even for, say, first-year courses. But now as an emeritus professor, last year you retired, perhaps you don't have any classes anymore. Do you have any plans for the next years, for the future?
My calendar is as busy as ever. I've got conferences to attend, talks to give, interviews like this to give, and even occasional guest lectures and courses. So as long as I can keep my marbles relatively intact, I'm going to keep doing it.
Oh, that's wonderful. So thanks so much for coming on this podcast, Dan.
Well, you're welcome. It's been good talking with you, and you've asked good questions.
That's nice to hear. Thank you. Thank you for listening to my conversation with Daniel Dennett today. You can find links to his memoir and his research in the links of the show notes. This was the first episode of my podcast. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing. And with that, I wish you a pleasant day.